Good afternoon. Before we start looking at how to ID different mammals and amphibians and reptiles, I want to talk about one of the amazing projects that we have going on, and that's our different animal atlases. We map these species. The reason why we have a lab devoted to this in the first place is because when Dave Hackett wrote this course years ago, the Mammal Atlas project was in full swing. And we currently still have atlas projects going on. So you being able to ID some of these creatures and add to those maps, those atlases, is a really important part about being a scientist. The Mammal Atlas happened in the 90s. It was made up of mostly volunteers, and there were a few professionals, people like Dave Hackett, who was a professional mammal biologist. It was mapping out, primarily looking for indigenous species, but mapped out any introduced species that they found along the way as well. It was primarily using a UTM grid reference. So this is before the standardization of affordable GPSs. It was assuming that people would not have an electronic GPS, but would have access to some kind of topographic map. So when we talked about those map reference, UTM grid reference, that's what people used to record these sightings. They were given a 100-meter squared area that they would survey regularly, and there was different ways of doing that, and record what they found. If it was a common mammal, you only needed to cite it once to report it. But if it was a provincially significant or rare mammal, you needed to have multiple sightings for it to be considered an accurate sighting. Just seeing it once, maybe they're not trusting that it was actually there. Sightings came in different types. And this counts for most critter sightings, whether that's a mammal, a bird, an amphibian. But when they were doing the Mammal Atlas, the things they were looking for were evidence of past habitation. So this can be a specimen. So if you found a skull or part of a skeleton, any amount of fur, or even if you found the animal itself, all of those prove that this is there. And if you can get a picture of that in situ, so it's not just me saying, oh yeah, I totally found a moose skull. Here's a picture of that moose skull. Here's a picture of that moose antler. Here's a picture of that deer fur. And showing a photograph of the actual animal is even better if you have it. But all of those are evidence that this animal has lived here in the past. It might not be here right now, but it was here at some point to leave these voucher specimens. And they did actually ask people to hand in pictures they'd taken in the past. So you could say, oh, I took this picture on the French River in '82. And they could use that as evidence of past habitation to help them further their atlas for current sightings. To know that the specimen is there right now, you'd have to have either someone cite it live or trap it or capture it in some way. And they did get people who trap fur bearers or hunt animals were part of this project as well. So all the animals that came into the fur barn here in North Bay, and they had the OMNR, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, were helping them as well in terms of what was being caught that year. If you found a fresh carcass, you could count that as evidence of current habitation. If you found fresh antlers, because moose and deer lose their antlers every year. Scat is current habitation, definitely within the year, usually within the week or the month. If you could find hair and quills that looked fresh on something that hadn't been sitting there for a very long time, footprints typically mean that this is happening now, or territorial markings that you might see bears scratching trees. That's usually pretty easy to see that that's here and now. Same with, I was saying about moose browse or deer browse, when they cut and eat the buds off the trees. You can tell if that's fresh or if that's last year's. And then lots of animals create a bit of a home for themselves. So beaver dams, fox dens, different things like that, a bear nest, a squirrel's food cache. If you can smell an animal like a skunk or a weasel, if you can hear an animal like a wolf, then you have some more evidence. The Breeding Bird Atlas has happened several times. I've been a part of it in the past, and it's starting up again January 1st. So if you want to be a part of the new atlas, my name is actually in one of the old ones. Your name can be in the new one, possibly. This is all volunteers, birds in a way that mammals and amphibians and reptiles do not have a following like birders. Birding is super, super popular. I'm also a birder, so I understand why. I don't understand why they're more popular than amphibians and frogs, because I love them as well. But maybe because they come to your backyard and they're mobile, so you can get species different times a year, different species. But again, we're looking at mostly indigenous nesting birds, but also any introduced species that are here. We're using the UTM grids, so that same mapping system, but now we're assuming people have access to some kind of electronic GPS system. We have Ontario divided into a grid, and people who are assigned grids do point counts in that grid, but then some volunteers are just recording what they see at their backyard feeders as well. So there's different systems being put in place. I'm not exactly sure how this January 2021 system is going, because all the meetings have been on Tuesday nights, exactly when I have class. I've missed a few of them, but I'm hoping to get caught up in the protocols for this new one. Typically, the populated areas get a lot of data, and what they're looking for are people to go and fill in the unpopulated areas, which for me has been handy because there's been sort of gaps in near the Temagami area, which has been great for me in the past, an excuse to go paddling in Temagami. So maybe you guys can be a part of this. For birds, same sort of thing as for mammals. We want to see an actual bird in season with a mate, and then we can assume that they are a breeding pair. If we can find a nest in use, now that's awesome. We can find birds with food in their mouth flying towards a nest, or birds with nesting material, building a nest. Finding pieces of eggshell that have been dropped or hidden is a dead giveaway that you have nestlings. You can find bird droppings, so most birds roost somewhere at night and they'll poop underneath of that roost site, so you can find those droppings. Feathers will give you an idea that a bird has been there that year recently, but unless you have a distinctive species like a yellow-shafted flicker, it is difficult to ID specific feathers to specific bird species. There are some that are easier than others, but it definitely can be helpful. A lot of birders rely on calls. Every bird has a very distinctive call, some more distinctive than others, and they typically have different calls in the mating season than out of season. So you can tell that you have breeding warblers because the males are singing their songs and they're quite distinctive. And you might not be able to see those warblers in the deep forest that you're in, but you can hear them. The Breeding Bird Atlas in the past has differentiated a sighting and a conferred breeding pair sighting. So just because the bird is in the area doesn't mean it's breeding in the area. So this changes because we get things like snow geese that fly through seasonally, but don't actually breed here. So that's why we have that distinction. And then we have the Herpetofaunal Atlas. This has been going on long term. It's still collecting data. If you do the Herp ID little lesson like this, I actually have the link to go to Ontario Nature Citizen Science page, and you can currently add data. They really do like you to add a picture with your sighting, and when you can, some kind of coordinates. You record the habitat, weather conditions, any behaviors you see, what kind of sighting you had. Mostly we get visual sightings for turtles and snakes, and then a lot of the frog and toad sightings are done by call, but we do get visual ones as well. There are way fewer salamander sightings than frog, toad, turtle, and snake sightings, just because salamanders are a little bit more elusive. They're forest leaf litter kind of species. They're not out there calling and visiting us. So a little bit more difficult. But those are the animal atlases that are around Ontario, and I highly recommend that you become part of them.